Okay, so I guess we'll start now. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend today's session and helping celebrate National Indigenous History Month. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands across Turtle Island. Turtle Island is a name for Earth or North America used by some Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands on which we live and work, and from which we have all benefited. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So please, everyone, we're now just going to take a moment of reflection. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So now we're going to move on to a few key moments in Indigenous history in Canada. Indigenous nations tell their own stories about the origins of the world and their place in it. All claim their ancestry dates to time immemorial. At the same time, there is considerable archaeological debate about when humans first came to North America. Though broad assumptions suggest waves of migration from northeastern Asia by both land bridge and boat between 30,000 and 13,500 years ago. From 18,000 to 10,000 BCE, irrefutable archaeological evidence of human occupation in the northern half of North America, including the Tanana River Valley, Alaska, Haida Gwaii, British Columbia, and Vermilion Lakes, Alberta, and Debert, Nova Scotia. From 10,000 to 2000 BCE, settlements and communities are present almost everywhere in what is now Canada. From coast to coast to coast, Indigenous peoples adapt to their surroundings, establish complex religious, artistic, and literary practices, as well as economical, social, and political structures. In the years 500 to 1200, developed communities on the plains employ treaties to share territory with humans and non-human beings. In the year 1000, Norse explorers meet Skraelings, possibly Dorset, Inuit, Thule, or Beothuk, on Baffin Island and Newfoundland and Labrador. They exchange goods, but hostility and violence prevent lasting Norse settlement. In the year 1500, estimates for the Indigenous population in what would become Canada range from 200,000 to 500,000 people, though some suggest it was as high as 2.5 million, with between 300 and 450 languages spoken. In 1493, the papal bull Inter Caetera, the Doctrine of Discovery, is decreed a year after Christopher Columbus's first voyage to America. Made without consulting Indigenous populations, nor with any recognition of their rights, it is the means by which Europeans claimed legal title to the New World. In 1500 to the 1530s, continual contact between European fishermen and the Indigenous peoples on the Atlantic coast begins. In 1615, the first European missionaries arrived to convert Indigenous populations to Catholicism. In the 1600s, Indigenous technology and knowledge of hunting, trapping, guiding, food, and disease proved crucial to the survival of Europeans and early colonial economy and society, particularly in the supply of beaver pelts and other furs. The establishment of alliances gives Indigenous peoples across Indigenous peoples access to European weaponry and other goods. In 1701, 36 Indigenous groups and the French colonial government signed the Great Peace of Montreal, forging peaceful relations that end nearly a century of war between the Haudenosaunee and the French and their Indigenous allies. In the 1600s and 1700s, tuberculosis, smallpox, and measles spread, intentionally or inadvertently, across North America, devastating indigenous populations. In 1754 to 1763, the 7 Years' War begins in North America. Hostilities between the French and English centered in Europe beginning in 1756, but the fight for control of North America with indigenous allies on both sides starts in 1754. In 1763, King George III of Britain declares dominion over North America east of the Appalachian Mountains. His royal proclamation gives limited recognition of title to indigenous communities and provides guidelines for negotiating treaties on a nation-to-nation basis. And in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation grants land negotiated 9 years earlier by Thayendanegea Joseph Brant to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in return for helping Britain during the American Revolution. And in 1812 to 1814, the War of 1812 sees tens of thousands of indigenous people fight for their land, independence, and culture as allies of either Great Britain or the United States. In British North America, the Western Confederacy plays a crucial role in protecting Upper and Lower Canada from American invasion. By the end of hostilities, almost 10,000 Indigenous people had died from wounds or disease. The Treaty of Ghent, which is supposed to return lands and all possession rights and privileges to the Indigenous peoples affected by the war, is ignored. And in 1828, the Mohawk Institute opens in Brantford, Upper Canada, Ontario, as a day school for boys from Six Nations Reserve. And in 1831, it begins to operate as a residential school with the goal of assimilating Indigenous children. It is the precursor to the more elaborate system of residential schools.
Thank you, Angela. I just came to the realization that I probably haven't met most of you. My name is Haley, and I will be taking you through the mid 1800s to the late 1900s. And I'll just begin by highlighting that there were quite a few treaties and acts that were signed and passed during this time. So I'm just going to start by highlighting a few of those. Just to begin with, we have the Robinson Superior and the Robinson Huron treaties that were signed in Ontario and BC, respectively. And these treaties were exploitative in nature. They were essentially to claim natural resources in exchange for annual cash payments. And following this, we had several acts passed. First, we had the Gradual Civilization Act, and this was to encourage assimilation to Euro-Canadian values. The offer was essentially for men who were educated and over the age of 21 to receive land, but in exchange, it would mean that they would lose their status as an Indigenous person and treaty rights. Following this, we had the British North American Act, and this was established in order to convey that the colonial responsibility for Indigenous people would now become a federal matter. And then following this, we see the signing of 11 numbered treaties, and they are still controversial and contested to date. Many chiefs say that the initial spirit of the treaties has been disregarded. It has essentially made land available for white settlement in exchange for cash and agricultural tools. Next, we see the passing of the Indian Act, and the goal within this act is still to encourage assimilation through economic, social, and political regulation. Further amendments were made to restrict Indigenous rights and freedoms, just to name a few, banning hereditary chiefdoms, expropriating reserve lands, requiring permission to leave reserve lands, revoking statuses, mandatory attendance of residential schools. And if a woman were to marry a non-Indigenous man, it would mean that she would lose her status as an Indigenous person. Next, 1883 marks the creation of the residential schools run by Christian churches, and we'll touch a little bit more on that later. From the 1960s to the 1900s, we see the population of Inuit people in the Arctic dwindle as a result of malnutrition and disease inflicted by European whalers. In 1885, the Métis and national allies of indigenous people lead the Northwest resistance, and they call for improved treatment and try to protect their existing rights. Oh. And that inevitably results in military action, where unfortunately the federal troops prevailed. Then from 1914 to 1918, we see approximately 4,000 to 6,000 Indigenous people serve in the First World War. And upon their return, they were denied veterans' benefits and supports. And we see this again in World War II. In 1919, the League of Indians formed to advocate for improved living conditions and again to try and protect their existing rights. And this essentially forms the basis for Indigenous political organization in the future. In 1929, we see the increase of complaints that Indigenous people do not bear Christian surnames. And then we again see this effort for assimilation to try, through the project surname. As previously mentioned, in 1939 to 1945, we see 5,000 to 8,000 Indigenous people serving in the Second World War and again denied veterans benefits and supports upon their return home. In 1951 and 1960, we see a slight bit of progress, if you'd like to call it that, as amendments were made to the Indian Act to give elected band councils more power, to award women the right to vote in band elections, and to lift bans of certain cultural practices. Also, status Indigenous people were given the right to vote in federal elections without losing their status. This brings us to the 60s scoop, where from the 1960s to the 1980s, there were thousands of Indigenous children taken from their family and communities by the provincial and federal social workers and placed often with non-Indigenous families, leaving children with a lost sense of cultural identity and parents emotionally traumatized. In 1969, there was a proposition to transfer responsibility of Indigenous affairs from federal to provincial jurisdiction, which ultimately failed as a result of substantial opposition from Indigenous people and Indigenous organizations. And then in 1973, we have the Calder case decision, which was brought to the Supreme Court. And if there are any students on the call, I feel that we are quite familiar with this case, as it was, at least at Dal, extremely at length discussed. This decision marks the recognition that Indigenous people held title to land before European colonization, and that this title still exists in law unless it's specifically extinguished. And this case forced the government to adopt new policies surrounding land claims not covered by treaties. And I'll just pass it off to Andrea now.
Thank you, Haley and Angela. So I'm just going to scroll back to the beginning. And I'm going to take us through the 80s onward. So starting in 1980 to 1981, activists traveled from train all the way from Vancouver to Ottawa aboard what they called the Constitution Express. And that was to raise awareness about the lack of recognition of Indigenous rights in the proposed Canadian Constitution. Then, of course, in 1982, that Constitution was patriated. And thanks to their advocacy, of them and other Indigenous people, Section 35 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal title and treaty rights. Later, Section 37 is also amended, obligating the federal and provincial governments to consult with Indigenous peoples on outstanding issues, which I'm sure is something our lawyers encounter from time to time. And then also in 1982, the Assembly of First Nations is formed out of the National Indian Brotherhood to promote the interests of First Nations in the realm of self-government, respect for treaty rights, education, health, land, and resources. So we'll jump to 1990 when the Meech Lake Accord collapsed because Elijah Harper, who was at the time the lone First Nations member in the Manitoba legislature, blocks its passage, citing the Accord's failure to consult with First Nations and recognize their constitutional rights. Then in 1996, we have the closure of the Gordon Residential School in Punitchi, Saskatchewan, which marks the end of the residential school system. So this may have been new knowledge for some of us. I know it was for me, that the legacy of the residential school system did extend into 1996, which is really quite recent history and rather disturbing, frankly. So good to reflect on that. Also in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is established. It recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools and calls for improved relations between governments, Indigenous peoples, and non-Indigenous Canadians. Interesting that it happened in the same year that that last school was closed. Throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were several key decisions respecting Indigenous peoples at the Supreme Court of Canada, including a 1997 ruling that traditional Indigenous land rights and title cannot be extinguished by British Columbia government and validating oral testimony as a source of evidence. Another was a 2003 ruling prescribing 3 conditions for Métis status: self-identification, ancestral connection, and historical Métis community, and acceptance by a Métis community. Okay, in 2005, there was the Kelowna Accord, which follows 18 months of consultation among all levels of government and Indigenous leaders on health, education, social and economic improvements for Indigenous peoples. And while $5 billion is promised, no formal agreement on how to dispense the money is reached, and a federal election is called, and the accord is not implemented by the new government. Seems to be somewhat of a trend, unfortunately. Also in 2015, oh, sorry, I skipped a couple here. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issues a statement of apology to former students of residential schools in Canada for the harm caused by assimilation goals, abuse, and cultural loss. And then in 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau extends that apology to students of residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. In 2012, 4 women start the Idle No More campaign as a national movement of marches and teach-ins, raising awareness of Indigenous rights and advocacy for self-determination. Also in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issues its final report documenting the experiences of approximately 150,000 residential school students and survivors. And finally, on this forum in 2016, an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is launched in response to calls to action for families, communities, and organizations. And I'll just mention a couple of other things that go beyond this resource. Of course, the inquiry for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls started in 2016, and the report was issued in 2019. In 2020, you'll recall that protests erupted in Nova Scotia when the Spinacity First Nation launched a Mi'kmaq-regulated first rights-based lobster fishery in St. Mary's Bay, which they were entitled to do based on a long disputed Supreme Court ruling from 1999 that affirmed treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. Then in May of this year, you will all be aware of the fact that bodies were found on the grounds of a residential school in BC, and searching has commenced across the country at other locations. And of course, not long after that, on June 3rd, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released their, that panel released their action plan. So there's much work to be done on all fronts. So that concludes our brief overview of key moments in Indigenous history, of course, acknowledging that this is by no means comprehensive, and we encourage you all to seek out additional resources to help broaden your knowledge of important events and significant contributions of Indigenous people to the cultural, social, and political landscape over many, many centuries, both pre and post contact. We have shared some resources on our diversity and inclusion discussion board on Hector, and we encourage you to do the same if you discover any resources that you find particularly enlightening, including video documentaries such as the one we've chosen to share with you today. So Stolen Children is a CBC documentary that features first voice accounts from residential school survivors. Their stories include descriptions of physical and sexual abuse, as well as psychological trauma, which may be triggering for some people. If you think it might be harmful for you to watch this video, we encourage you to mute your computer audio and minimize your meeting window for approximately 19 minutes. I'll now share the browser and audio and press play and hope it works. If you can't hear the audio, just send me an IM via Skype and I'll see what I can do to troubleshoot.
I got frightened when I was a little girl when the principal used to beat up the other children like boys. The boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and private parts of your body. You don't have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
I just remember arriving there and donning new clothes and, of course, getting a haircut and sitting in a classroom and being with other girls and witnessing my brother get punched by the supervisor.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. I spent about 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me. and that not to worry, I would be looked after.
Our parents didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent in a boat with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Then he would come back again, come and take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter's dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
At that time, they never told us that our sisters were across the hallway. And I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric. And I went running to her and I reached onto her, and just hugged her. And I was just shaking, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this, is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys were watching, and the girls were still going through,
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life. Edgerton Ryerson, 1847 Report for Indian Affairs.
Visits from my parents were very rare, but I do recall one visit when my mother and father came. And I remember specifically my mother's red tam, that splash of color. I remember her getting out of the wagon, and I was crying already watching them because I was missing them already. They hadn't even walked through the door yet of the residential school, but I was missing them already. And when they were actually leaving, I cried until my nose bled.
And you learn pretty quick after getting those kind of beatings. Not strapping, it's literally beatings, And ever since that day, I tried to run away. And I made friends with a guy by the name of Donald Atkinson from Rosa River First Nation. And we planned, to take off. And when we got caught, we paid for dearly, you know. Not only the RCMP gave us a licking, but the boys the bigger boys that was helping them chase us down.
Were you angry at your parents that they made you go to school?
Sometimes I would think about them. I get mad for all giving me here, sending me over there where all the bad treatment is. And
Tell me how you felt when you saw your children go to that school.
well, I felt sad. My first two boys went, and then a couple of years after, the next two boys went, and so on as they got older. Yeah, I told them to be strong. I had always told them to be strong, to be able to take it like the other children.
So you sent 11 kids to residential school?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them do you think were strong through that?
None of them. None of them.
What about your children? How do you think it affected them being in residential
Well,
school?
like I said, a little bit crazier than before they went to school. Their mind was a little bit more intact, staying at home with us. They knew how to hunt ducks, and they knew how to fish, and they knew how to snare rabbits. Babies. Today you don't see that.
And you think that's the school?
Yeah. Everything destroyed in our world. We didn't bother white people. White people bothered me.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
There are three reasons why I think residential schools are a blot on the Canadian landscape. One is that we became strangers in our home and native land. Two is that nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood. Three is that it added to our mental stress in a very real way.
My name is Michael Loft. I'm from Ganawagi. I'm 55 years old, okay, and my dad attended residential school for 11 continuous years in Spanish Ontario. He says, and once he told me a story where they were so bored, they were in I think the cafeteria, and they would just walk in a circle, you know, because they couldn't just go run around, you know, willy-nilly all over the residential school just because school was out. They had to be controlled, I guess, had to be contained, and so they would walk in circles, you know, in the cafeteria, round and round and round and round, to deal with their boredom.
My name's Lorena Fontaine. I'm 38 years old, and both my parents and grandparents went to residential school. I was at a conference that my mom was speaking at. She was giving the keynote address, and she started talking about her residential school experience during her speech. And and that's how I found out. Well, I was, of course, I was shocked and appalled, and I just felt so terrible for her. I felt frozen when I was listening to her. And it wasn't until after she finished speaking that I started thinking about our family life. I started thinking about the abuse that was very prevalent when I was a child, and I started putting connections together.
He never knew when he was going to get hit in residential school. That's the thing. So he lived like in fear of getting hit. You break a rule, you get whacked, you know. So it was unpredictable. You know, you couldn't, you could try to learn the rules as best as you could, but I mean, you're a kid, you know, you'd mess up and whack, you know. So there was that unpredictability that he brought home too. And the same thing with us. We didn't know what was going to happen, you know, next. So it was scary.
I was raised by parents who never had a childhood, and they didn't have any parents as role models. So we were vulnerable children. And a lot of us were abused ourselves as young children. And I also realized at that point that one of the people who abused me in my family had been a residential school survivor, a family member. And I understood why now, why I was abused.
The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and to assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Sir John A. Macdonald, May 2nd, 1887.
He got out, you know, like everybody gets out at 16, and he eventually made his way to Aguizasne, to his home, and he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand the culture. So he couldn't take it, you know. He was frustrated. He was going nowhere. So he went back to the residential school for one more year because it seemed like that was home now. That was home. And that's where he could, you know, they spoke his language, and so that's where he went.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
There was a lot of fear. I think the fear that they put in him, the terror that they put in him. I mean, he managed to bring that with him, and it went into our family, you know. And I learned terror and fear and all that as well as a child. I put fear in my sons too. That's all I knew, you know. When they were doing something that was right, I would put fear in them, you know.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
Generally, the survivors of residential school do not commit suicide any more than the general population. Okay. It's the children of the residential school survivors who commit suicide in incredibly high numbers. You know, 6 to 7 times, you know, the provincial average. Okay.
It might just take one person to start talking about it, or perhaps a family to start talking about the fact that there is abuse, and the reason why there's that abuse is because of the residential school experience. That, you know, we're not abusive people by trade. We're not, we weren't born that way. And to be able to, I think families need to be able to realize that they're not alone, that none of us are alone anymore, that we have each other, and that it's okay to start talking about it.
We don't have the monopoly on pain and hurt, but we have and have carried a disproportionate share of it over time. And I would really like us to move forward, not to erase our memory of who we are, because residential school is certainly a part of who we are. I'd like us all to be a part of a team that really makes a lasting difference for not only residential school survivors, but the other little children who are having difficulties today.
Okay. Thank you all so much for your attention to that film. It's pretty heavy. There are, of course, many other documentaries available online, and we again encourage you to share your recommendations on Hector. We welcome your comments, but before we open the floor for discussion, we want to run through a 3-step Indigenous Ally Toolkit published by the Montreal Indigenous Community Network. Thank you. Yes, very powerful. I hope others agree. Okay, so this is our Indigenous Ally Toolkit. I'll run through the first portion and then I'll hand it over to Haley, I think is number 2, and Angela will finish us up. So the first step in being a good ally is being critical about your motivations. So when you're getting involved with any kind of ally work, you should ask yourself these questions. And these are relevant for any community, whether it's Indigenous or African Nova Scotian or African Atlantic Canadian. These are all really important questions to ask yourself. One is, does your interest derive from the fact that the issue is currently buzzing? So, you know, it obviously the dark legacy of treatment of Indigenous people in what we now call Canada is certainly in the news a lot lately. And so I think it's really important for us to be really deliberate and reflective on why we wish to now be an ally, or whether we're already an ally, and what was our original motivation. And does my interest stem from the fact that the issue will meet quotas or increase chances of any funding, which may be relevant to any organizations that you work with? And does my involvement hijack the message and insert my own opinions or values instead of respecting those of the Indigenous communities? Am I doing this to feed my ego? So these movements and struggles do not exist to further one's own self-interest, nor are they extracurricular activities. So it's really about just asking yourself in a really critical way, why am I an ally? Why do I want to be an ally? To be an ally is to actively support this struggle. It's to stand up even when you feel scared, to transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who have less. And it's to acknowledge the conversation is not about you. And we must always remember, being involved in any kind of anti-oppression work is about recognizing that every person has basic right to human dignity, respect, and equal access to resources. At the end of the day, being an ally goes beyond checking actions off a list, and it is not a competition. Being an ally is about a way of being and doing. It means self-reflection, checking in with one's motivations, and debriefing with community members is a continual process. It is a way of life.
Thanks, Andrea. This is Angela. Actually, I'm going to read step number 2
Oh,
and Haley
sorry.
will do step number 3. No, that's okay. So step number 2 is actually starts with learning. And here are a list of terms that will help you get started on educating yourself on the history of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. Educating yourself is an ongoing process. Change will not be easy, and you will never truly be an expert on Indigenous challenges and realities, but you can work on your allyship. So, a good rule of thumb is to ask yourself, how can I use this new information in my everyday life? And what steps can I personally take to amplify marginalized voices that are too often silenced? And what do I have and how can that be leveraged? And how can I use my position and privileges to listen, shift power dynamics, and to take steps towards active reconciliation? I mean, remember that Indigenous people are grandparents and parents, children and siblings. They are doctors and teachers, social workers, entrepreneurs, and they're artists, and they are human beings. Indigenous people are present and thriving in a country that expected them to die off, and that continues to enforce structures of oppression today. They are resilient. And I want everyone to take note of some words never to use for people of Indigenous descent. You will see those terms listed there.
Thank you, Angela. And I'm just going to cover step 3 now, which is to act accordingly. So is to educate oneself is only one half of the work when being an ally. It's a lifelong process that is rooted in action and requires humility and ongoing critical self-reflection. Being an ally is not a badge of honor, it is a sign of privilege. To do this, it is crucial to establish a direct line of communication. This could be through a friend directly involved or impacted by the struggle, or through a volunteer position at a community organization. And then just a couple bullet points here, acknowledging the fact that you are a guest on this island, recognizing that multiple nations exist within Turtle Island, and respecting any cultural protocols and traditions. So now I'm just going to cover a few suggestions for workplace and organizations to practice good allyship by hiring Indigenous people to be involved in the creation and ownership of initiatives that are made about them and or for them, by properly remunerating and crediting Indigenous people for their knowledge and time, passing the mic to Indigenous people at events in the arts, in music, in film, in theater, and in making decisions that affect them, and recognizing that Indigenous people have ownership, control, access, and possession of their information, knowledge, experience, and stories. And then just a couple of to-dos. Listen to the experts, ask what you can do, build relationships based on mutual consent and trust, research to learn more about the history, and continue to support and act in meaningful ways. This could entail calling out others and holding them accountable when they are displaying oppressive behaviors, hopefully in an educative and non-aggressive way. Because when it comes down to it, being a good ally is about risking your voice to elevate others. And I think I'm just going to pass it back over to Andrea now.
Thank you, Haley. Maybe I'll go ahead and share my camera now. Hi, everybody. So thanks so much, Angela and Haley, for bringing us through our Ally Toolkit. I hope everybody agrees that this is a helpful guide for anybody who feels they're ready to analyze and deepen their allyship to Indigenous communities. We have a little under 10 minutes left. So at this time, I'll just ask anybody if they want to come off mute to share a comment about any of the content we shared today or anything about Indigenous history generally. Please feel encouraged to do so now.
Andrea, it's Gavin.
Hi, Gavin.
Andrea, as you know, I've been working for about a decade or more with respect to the rehabilitation of Northern and Western First Nations communities, primarily education, economic development, opportunity for youth, and healthcare. And healthcare includes things like sustainable housing, potable water, proper recreational facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I've never heard the word allyship until now. And I've been working with government representatives, with the chiefs, with the Grand Chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations, and with the First Nations themselves, and with their tribal councils, or the government councils, as the James Bay Cree in Northern Quebec refer to them as. And I think they look at, my perception, perhaps incorrectly, has been that they look at me and people like me and the influence that we bring to bear primarily on their behalf with the federal government, primarily, although provincial governments are involved too. I think they look at it as more holistically and more homogeneously, and not so much that I didn't get the impression that I was being treated as different, and that I was anything other than perhaps not one of them, but a person who was articulating the same ideals as they have been articulating for a very long period of time. And I use that as the backdrop for this question. Should we be careful that we not get bogged down in structure? Because whenever we get bogged down in structure, it seems to me that it might be the antithesis of involvement.
I think that's a very good point, Gavin, and thank you for pointing it out. And I also want to say, before I or any of the other people on the line respond, like, we were very sensitive to, the fact that we ourselves, the organizers of this particular information session, do not come from Indigenous backgrounds. So we are not experts, and we certainly should not be counseling anybody on how to be an ally. For me, I don't think the conversation about allyship is about structure so much as it is about intentional intention. So it goes back to that piece about motivation, and how it's received by people of the Indigenous community is one piece. But I think as the ally, or the person who wishes to be empowering for Indigenous communities, I think it's more about their motivation versus how it's received on the other end. But I would certainly welcome anybody who practices Aboriginal law might be able to talk about their experience as well. And I would encourage that if anybody's willing to come off mute. Haley or Angela, did you have any thoughts?
I was just going to say, I think you make some great points, Andrea. I think also education is so key in this, and I think that's a part of being intentional. Yeah, I would just add that education piece onto it.
Yeah, I agree with Haley. I think education is really, really important. I hope that people were able to learn something today, especially from that heart-wrenching video. We hear the term residential schools tossed around so much. I don't know if some people are even aware of really what a residential school really was. So I hope that the video was definitely enlightening to some people, for sure.
Thank you, Angela. And I should credit you for having sourced the video. She unearthed it, and so it was her contribution, one of many contributions to the preparation for this session. I think another thing that stood out for me, beyond the fact that Alice just broke my heart, was and how childlike she was. I think the most enduring part of her account. But the fact that they interviewed the children of the students of residential schools, and it really, I think, put into focus the legacy and the generational trauma that has been passed down as a result of those experiences, and begins to clarify and make obvious the reasons why there continue to be some, generational challenges in Indigenous communities. But to your point, Gavin, there are also some other, problematic issues like access to clean water that, that remain beyond their control, and, definitely things that as a country as a land in which they currently inhabit, we need to do better. Yes, go ahead, Gavin.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about some of the historical commentators on the documentary with their unbelievably paternalistic and racist views on Indigenous peoples' culture. I've done a lot of work in healthcare, especially with the James Bay Cree of Northern Quebec. They achieved a significant land claim settlement with the Quebec government about 25 years ago. And rather than taking that money and squandering it on pickup trucks and snowmobiles, that money was used by the band to generate a very, very broad economic basis, which includes Cree construction, scholarships for Indigenous students who want to go south for educational purposes. They've invested heavily in their own healthcare, which they manage and which they populate with their own experts, including physicians and nurses and technicians of all types. And it's really a very interesting example of what you can achieve when you take an oppressed culture and de-oppress them so that they can bloom on their own. And, James Bay Cree is headed by a CEO by the name of Stephen Bearskin, Bearskin, a very traditional name in Indigenous culture. And he has an MBA from Wharton School of Business. And he's just an incredible, dynamic, bright, intuitive, compassionate guy. And I've also met many of their senior operatives in their healthcare field, and they're all deeply, deeply impressive people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gavin. And I think and I hope that there are many other examples like that, where Indigenous communities, really do thrive when they're empowered. And I think our role as allies is to amplify those stories and to help those stories just come into reality and in a more frequent way. Thank you for sharing that. Again, I'll pause and ask if anybody else would like to share anything about their personal experiences as allies in Indigenous community. Go ahead, Angela.
No, I was just going to add something else, but I'll just pause to see if anyone else wants to add anything before I jump in. It's quiet, so I'll go ahead. I just wanted to thank the three of you on behalf of the firm. So Angela and Andrea and Haley, that was excellent. And you're right, it is an education journey. So just really appreciate you pulling this together. And I know there's others behind the scene who helped as well from the action team, but just thank you for bringing this education to us today. And it was very emotional. And this is our way of becoming stronger allies. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you to everybody on the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. And yes, my colleagues on this action team. We were so grateful to have Haley join us quickly after she joined the firm. And of course, Angela has been along the way. And a great deal of time went into this. And we are just so grateful to everybody for taking the time to join. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.